Hey everybody, and welcome to Chapter 9. Chapter 9, we are talking about concept formation and knowledge acquisition, and we're going to be talking about how concepts and knowledge are represented in the mind. So it's a cool chapter, but it is definitely a change of pace compared to what we've been doing. What we've been doing is both kind of very, very basic in terms of like thinking about visual perception, object recognition, and also very memory focused. Now we're going to be moving away from that. And so the things that we're going to be talking about from here on out are going to be much more modular. So Chapter 9 is kind of related to Chapter 10, and Chapter 10 is kind of related to Chapter 11 and 12, and so on. Is not going to be the case where we have these big passages or big, series of chapters that are all about memory or all about perception. All right, so let's get into it. This is a fun chapter. What we're talking about today in this video series is essentially how we represent what we know, so how we represent our memories, and we will be talking about how non-humans compare to this. We're going to be looking at a specific study that looks at pigeons and how they respond to art. We will talk about how we create categories and concepts, and then finally we will make a return to schemas, which is an idea that we talked about way back in the day, Chapter 8. We were talking about how situations in memory inform one another. So I mentioned a little bit about how we're going to be talking about birds and art. There's a cool video here that you can check out whenever you get a chance, just in case you want to see that in the real world or brought to life, live action. But I will say though that the guy in that video who's talking about this stuff is not actually the researcher that did this research. I don't know why the documentary series that covered this presents it like that. I don't know. It doesn't matter. Let's get into it. So we're going to be talking about how knowledge is represented. So what I want to do is try to make a segue and try to make this transition from memory into concept formation. And so I want to do that by asking you to think about something that you read recently. And it can be a book. It can be a news article or whatever. Usually I will ask folks to think about a book that they read like in middle school or high school. So think about The Hunger Games, for example, if you read that book, or The Fault in Our Stars or whatever. You're thinking about this book, okay? So if you're thinking about that, what is it about that book that you really remember? This is where I pause in the classroom and I ask people to give their accounts of what they remember. And what I find is that generally people don't remember the exact words or the exact phrases of things. Instead, people tend to remember kind of the meaning of things. And even more than that, they tend to think about the emotional content, the importance of characters and their actions and things like that. We think very little and we remember very little about the specific words that are used, or even how those words look or how the paragraphs look and things like that. So we typically don't remember kind of the visual content of what we're reading, but we do remember the semantic content of what we're reading. And if you remember back to Chapter 6, I think it was, in that memory chapter, we were talking about levels of processing. That totally makes sense why that would be the case. We remember the things that have some kind of importance to us. Things like the style of a paragraph. We typically don't think about that stuff, or because it's not important to us, we don't remember it long term. But thinking about characters, and the plots that they're in, how they save the day, or how they I was about to give a spoiler for The Fault in Our Stars, but probably you already know what that is if you've heard of that book. So typically it's those kind of big things, is much less the specific words that are used. Now sometimes there are words that do stick out. So like for example, I don't know, you can think of a phrase in Harry Potter that maybe you remember. And maybe you remember that because it is a very important phrase. But most phrases we are not going to remember. So there was a study that went to try to essentially capture what it is about when we are reading stuff that we remember. So this is a little bit of a recap. I asked in Chapter 6 about which of these is the real penny, and I waited for you to give me an answer, but because this is the internet, I didn't get an answer from you. That's okay. There's technology that, I don't know. There's a joke there to be made. I don't know. You can make it yourself. So which of these is the real penny? The real penny here is going to be this one right here. But again, this is kind of hard, and it's kind of hard, especially considering that you just looked at this in Chapter 6, and you should know better. You should know what the answer was. So the reason why this is difficult is because what we are remembering is the importance of something, and much less what it looks like or what it sounds like. So we're really good at remembering the gist of something, and you've probably heard that word before, the gist, which is kind of like saying like the overall impact of something. So you remember the overall story about what pennies are, but you may not remember what the exact details are. You might even know what they're made of, but you may not know what's on the front of them. Why? Because that stuff has never mattered, right? You've never been quizzed on that before. You've never been tested on that before. You've never been handed a handful of pennies and you had to detect which of them are forfeits, or counterfeit, or which one of them are fake. So we're really good at remembering the gist. We're much less good at remembering the details, and that's because we're extracting the meaning from that content and not necessarily the exact wording or what they look like. So the study that I want to talk about here very briefly is Warner 1968, and in this particular study what this guy did is he had people read basically like a very short paragraph, and he told people that he got people to read a couple of sentences, and he told them either there might be some kind of changes that are made, or there might not be some changes that are made. And in both cases, he made changes. But there were two types of changes. He made some changes that were relevant to the content of the paragraph, and he made some that were about the appearance of the paragraph, so specific words that were used or how the paragraph was formatted. And this was later replicated with images just to show that it's not specifically text-based. This is something that is true for all types of content and all types of media. So what we're looking at here, we have two groups. We have those that were warned about changes and ones that were not warned about changes. And then we have the two different kinds of changes, those that were impacting the meaning of the paragraph and those that were impacting the style of the paragraph. And so what we find here, let's look at, I'm going to look at this over here on the right first. I'm going to take this backwards maybe. So what we find here is that those folks that were warned ahead of time, hey, there are going to be changes that I'm going to be making. See if you can spot them. What they did is they did pretty well for whenever the paragraph was changed for its meaning. They did not do nearly as well whenever it was the style of the paragraph. So what does that mean? Basically, if you're taking a paragraph and you are tweaking the words that you use, but the overall meaning is the same, you might be able to catch a difference. You might be able to, 3 out of 4 people, it's pretty good. We're able to spot the difference whenever you change a word or the style of a paragraph. But if you change the meaning of the paragraph by substituting some of the words so that instead of saying, the girl went to the grocery store, you said the girl went to the library. That changes the meaning of that sentence. We find that more than 9 out of 10 people were able to spot that. So let's contrast that with the people that were not warned that there was a change. In that case, for meaning, it goes up to almost 100%. So almost every single person, if you don't even warn them, they will be able to spot a change in the paragraph if the meaning is different. The fascinating thing, though, is that, that is fascinating. This is all fascinating, but one of the fascinating things about that is that for memory for style, it goes down to chance level, 50%. So people they're just guessing at that point if there was a change or not. And that's because we don't remember style. And even whenever we are warned that there might be changes that are being made in this group, we see that it only increases by, 15-20%, which is pretty good, but still not nearly as high as meaning for memory. So this brings us to actually one of my favorite areas of cognitive psychology, but we're actually not going to go into it that much this semester just because it is usually considered a higher level topic in cognitive psychology. And I think what they really mean by that is that it's just kind of very nitty gritty and detail oriented. And I typically don't like that stuff, but I think this stuff is super fascinating. So this is going to lead us into a conversation about informational codes. And this dates back to the 80s. This guy named Delos Wickens, he wrote a book called Encoding Categories of Words. In terms of research, he's probably not one of the more popular names or familiar names, but he wrote this book that was both influential and led off a lot of other research in this field. Essentially what he was interested in is how information is represented in the brain and the types of ways that it can be represented and how that might change what we do and don't remember. So he was interested in how when we interact with new information, how is that maintained in our memory? And ultimately what he came to find is that things that can be stored, that can be encoded as a lingual code, which is a very fancy way of saying as a word or as something you can verbalize, that information will be stored that way. So in other words, if you can take an experience that you had and you can put it into words, generally your memory for that is going to be the words that define it. If there's something that you experience that you can't put into words, generally what you will remember is the raw, emotional, perceptual feeling of what that is. Why is that? Because basically the brain is lazy. And the brain, or maybe that's being mean to the brain. I'm sorry, brain. But really what we mean is that the brain is being efficient. So if you can take something that can be put into words, your brain wants to store it into words. It's much easier for us to do that. It requires much less work to store things as words than to store them as whole experiences attached with the original perception and the emotion and the feelings that we have regarding those things. So words and language are much easier. They're much more simple for our brains to handle than recalling and dealing with specific physical properties and perceptual properties of things. But that's true for most stimuli, but there's also a lot of stimuli that that cannot be verbalized, that cannot be put into words. And I will give you an example. So I'm going to show you a series of images, and I want you to tell me if any of them have repeated themselves, if you've seen one of them already in the list. So we're going to start out with this thing. I'm not going to say what it is, but you've probably seen one of these before, this circle. I'm going to take it away, and I want you to tell me, have you seen this in the series? Is this the same as what you just saw or not? Is this the same as what you just saw or not? Have you seen this so far in this video? Have you seen this so far in this video? And now if I were to show you this particular, this screen right here, you could probably go through and pick the specific ones that I showed you, right? I think I honestly was too busy focusing on what to say and not what these things actually look like. But I'm pretty sure that the ones that you just saw were this, and this, right? So those should be the ones that you saw. And this is a very easy thing for us to do. I'm not going to say why it's very easy, but chances are if you've been paying attention, you know why it's an easy distinction to be made. Let's do one more test. So here we go. So same rules. You're going to look at this image, this circle. Now, is this the same as what you just saw? Is this the same as one of the ones that you just saw? Have you seen this one so far? So if I were to ask you to pick out these specific circles that you saw just now, could you do that? Usually most people are like, oh, no, I can't do that. But sometimes you'll find some people who can. But this is just essentially going to show us the importance of verbalization and the importance of informational codes. That essentially it's really easy for us to make these distinctions with the coins, because the coins are all things we can put into words. We can say, oh yeah, that's a dime, that's a dime on heads, that's a dime on tails, that's a quarter, that's a penny. You get the idea. You have words that you can use to describe those things. For kaleidoscopes, much like our good friends the greebles from chapter 4, these are things that are maybe very vivid, and have lots of features, but are not features that we can easily put into words. If we wanted to, we probably could, but for all intents and purposes, these are all just kaleidoscopes, right? That's how we would explain what these are. They're just kaleidoscopic images. So why is it that this is particularly, or actually to take a step back, the people who that I've seen in class, whenever I show them images like this, those that are really good at this task would generally find a specific feature to look at, so that they're not actually classifying or categorizing these as kaleidoscopes, but rather defining them by, for example, the center color and what the center color is, or maybe what the outside colors are. Because if we go back, you can see that there is some variety, there is some variability in the center colors and what the particular colors are on the edges. So basically, if our brains want to handle things as words, and it's really good when it can do that. It's very efficient for us to do that. And things that we can't put into words, we typically are not as prepared, not as easily able to recognize, discriminate, remember, and so on. So the whole kind of, the big important message of this chapter is that the way that we approach information matters. That generally what we're looking for is the importance of something, the meaning of something, and that meaning is usually going to be encoded as a word when possible. But if not, we can still get by. It's just much harder for us to do. All right, I'm going to catch you in the next video. We're going to be diving into concepts and categories then. See you there.